Benvenuti a questo incontro con Adrian Wootton. Adrian Wootton, chi frequenta il Noirin Festival lo conosce perché da tanti anni è un nostro partner in crime del Noirin Festival, e Adrian Wootton è attualmente a capo della Film London, che è una compagnia governativa, un'istituzione governativa inglese che si occupa della produzione dei film internazionali in Gran Bretagna. È stato a lungo direttore della BFI London Film Festival, è attualmente il consulente per il London Film Festival del cinema italiano. Nel corso degli anni abbiamo anche collaborato insieme proprio per portare il cinema italiano al pubblico di Londra, e nel corso degli anni è diventato molto più esperto di me nel cinema italiano, e quindi ora è il volto ufficiale del cinema italiano, e si spende moltissimo per il pubblico inglese, con il pubblico inglese per il cinema italiano. Oltre a queste qualità, ne ha tantissime altre. È un esperto, un grande esperto di letteratura. Recentemente, negli anni passati, in occasione delle celebrazioni su Dickens, ha girato il mondo con delle masterclass su Dickens. Grandi nomi della letteratura sono appunto tra i soggetti di masterclass che lui tiene un po' in tutto il mondo, e oggi ci parlerà di un altro grande della letteratura che ci ha lasciato questo giugno. Cormac McCarthy è un grandissimo scrittore americano che ha prodotto anche diversi soggetti per il cinema. Quindi io non la faccio più lunga, lascio la parola a Adrian Wootton, che ci racconterà appunto il cinema basato su questo fantastico scrittore Cormac McCarthy. La lezione durerà credo un'ora, e quindi poi, se voi avrete delle domande, naturalmente siete liberi di farle. Adrian sarà molto felice di rispondervi. I've told that whenever we ask a question to you after the lecture, you will be happy to answer. Ok. Allora, buona lezione e grazie Adrian di essere ancora con noi. Thank you for being with us every year since, I don't know, lui è da 33 anni credo, it's 33 years. The same age of the festival is the age of our friendship and cooperation. Ok, allora auguri e ci sentiamo dopo.
Hello. That's good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Marina. And it's a bit shocking, 33 years being here, but it's always a tremendous pleasure to be at Noirin Fest and to have the opportunity to talk to people about things that really interest me in the genre. And I suggested this talk because this year we lost Cormac McCarthy at the age of 89, and because of his importance as a writer and because of his importance as a source for movies, and particularly some celebrated movies that I think do fall into the genre, I thought it'd be interesting to kind of trace his life and his relationship with genre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about his life, I'm going to talk about his work, I'm going to talk about the movies, I'm going to show you some clips from the movies, and hopefully trace this very curious career, because Cormac McCarthy wrote 12 novels, a few screenplays over the course of that long career, a couple of plays, and 3 short stories, and one essay. And he had a life, I think this is what's interesting, he had a life that is very similar to a very small number of other American writers. He was one of the great recluses, along with J.D. Salinger, Thomas Pynchon, Thomas Harris. He avoided public scrutiny. He never taught in a university. He never spoke to a student. He never wrote about his own work. And he gave 3 interviews, print interviews, in his entire life. And New York Times, Rolling Stone, and Time magazine, and 1 television interview, which I'll show you a little bit of, and a couple of other amateur interviews and podcasts. But for most of his career, from 1968 to the last books being published in 2023, he stayed out of the public gaze and really didn't talk about his work. So so actually, not only is it interesting to talk about Cormac McCarthy, the writer, but it's also a bit of a detective story investing Cormac McCarthy, the life, because he gave up so little of his life to the public. And there is still no biography of Cormac McCarthy. It'll be very interesting to see in the wake of his death whether someone does now try to publish a biography, because there's so little been actually written and so little that he said about his life and work. Anyway, before we get into that, I'm going to ask for the first. What I'm going to show you now is a montage we put together, which has got clips from the movies, and also those few clips, little clips of McCarthy himself speaking, and you'll just get a little bit of glimpse of Cormac McCarthy speaking on those few occasions he was filmed. So let's see the first montage, please, the first clip, please. Play the video, please. Oh, hang on. No. This, yeah.
I'm Cormac McCarthy.
How do you know when it's time to let it go? How do you know when the book is said, you're done? How do you know? Well, you just know. You told us stories. destroying the whole enterprise.
Thank you. That's a little glimpse of Cormac McCarthy and some of the movies, and actually all of the movies are reflected there, the half dozen movies. So he's born nearly 90 years ago, and he was born in Rhode Island, but very Catholic, Irish Catholic family, 6 children, one of 6 children, some early pictures of him there. But moved south to Tennessee, to Knoxville, Tennessee, in the late 1930s. His father was a lawyer. They were quite well-to-do at a time of the Great Depression in America. So he had quite a comfortable upbringing, affluent, as I said, and very interesting for a writer, and a writer of his stature. Wasn't interested in school, really didn't like studying, had very wide interest, and but had quite a lot of rows with his parents, particularly his father, arguments, because he wasn't interested in school and wanted to get out of school as quickly as he could. And there's a quote: "I wasn't going to be a respectable citizen." This is from one of the rare interviews. Sorry, is that better? Yep. Sorry, thank you, Marina. So I hated school the day I set foot in it. That says it all. That says it all about conventional education and Cormac McCarthy. This is, I think this is from the New York Times article, the very first serious big, and one of the few interviews he ever gave. But he did enroll in the university to study physics and engineering, not literature. And this is an interesting thing about McCarthy. He was always much more interested in science and maths, architecture and engineering than he was anything to do with literature. But still didn't stay there. Left and went into the Air Force in the 1950s, time of the Cold War. And he was stationed around, mainly in the States, but actually probably the most profound time was he was in Alaska. And whilst he was in Alaska, because there was nothing to do on this Air Force base in Alaska at all, zero, he just read and read and read and read. And these are some of his kind of his big influences. And these male writers are his big influences. So you've got Herman Melville there, Moby Dick. You've got Dostoevsky. You've got Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Dashiell Hammett, and Raymond Chandler. He came out of the Air Force and changed his mind and decided he would go back to college. And interestingly, he then did study English. But I think because he got this passion for reading whilst he was in the military. And he then started to write. And these are a couple of the short stories. He only wrote a very small handful of short stories. And they won awards. Both of them won awards for the quality of the writing. And suddenly he was going. Maybe he was going to be a writer. But his life was pretty strange, to be honest. He decided he wasn't going to finish college. He dropped out of college, and he met his first wife. And he had obviously an idea, and it's a very unusual. He had an idea that he was going to be a writer, but he wasn't going to. He didn't want to work in other jobs. He didn't want to be a teacher. He didn't want to go to carry on in college. He didn't want to do those things that actually most writers or academics do to support themselves, to earn money. He basically lived in a shack with nothing, with him and his wife, and they were in total poverty. They had no electricity, no running water. They washed in the river or the pond, and he just writes. They have a child, their first son, their son Cullen, but she can't stand it. His wife just cannot stand this horrible life that they're living. So she leaves, taking Cullen with her, and he's basically on his own in this shack in the Smoky Mountains, carrying on writing. I don't know quite how he lives, but it's interesting if you read the very last book, the last but one book that Cormac McCarthy wrote, which was published this year, The Passenger. That book is very, very autobiographical. It's one of the two books he wrote in his career that really are drawing on his own life. And there's a lot about the main character in The Passenger talking about living in a shack with no water and no electricity, hunting, trapping little animals, eating animals, catching fish, and living literally kind of wild. And that's drawn from those experiences as a young man living in the Smoky Mountains. Anyway, he moves to Chicago, and he decides he has to get a job, and he works in a place that sells mechanical car parts. And he finally manages to write and complete his first novel, The Orchard Keeper, late 1960s. And obviously everyone thinks he's got such promise, and there he is as a young man just finishing that. He's got such promise that actually he wins an award, the William Faulkner Foundation Award. It still exists, that award. It's called the Faulkner Pen Award now. But William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize-winning Southern author, who also was a great screenwriter, worked with Howard Hawks, Faulkner won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he used the money to create a foundation to help other writers. And it was that money that created the award that then McCarthy won. And the interesting about The Orchard Keeper is that it's a tough novel. It's set in between the wars. It's sort of 20s, 30s, and it is one of the central characters is an outlaw, bootlegger, murderer, and he starts his career by writing a novel which is a kind of Western crime, I wouldn't say thriller, but crime novel. So from the very beginning, he's drawing on two things. He's drawing on the Western, and he's drawing on crime novels. And it's pretty brutal. That's the other thing about McCarthy. From the very beginning, he decides he's going to write about violence without any kind of censorship. There's no subject in Cormac McCarthy that's taboo. Violence, murder, death, rape, cannibalism, incest, he takes it all on from the beginning. He's got a bit of money through this award, and he decides to travel. And he decides to travel in Europe, and he gets on an ocean liner, and he meets a British young dancer and actress on the ship. And there she is, there he is. And they kind of fall in love. She marries him, and they get married in England in 1966, the swinging 60s, and he's hanging out in sort of London, and he wins another literary prize, and then they end up in Ibiza in Spain, and he then is writing his second novel, The Outer Dark, which is a pretty, another second really bleak, difficult novel, which is about incest. And incest is something that he comes back to. He comes back to in his very last books that were published this year as well, Between a Brother and Sister. And That's published in '68. He's living in Spain. He's very interested in Spain, Spanish culture. He's interested in Latin American culture. And later on, to help his understanding of writing novels, he learns Spanish. And Spanish becomes the language, other than English, that he's most interested in. Comes back to the USA. And then even though he's earned a bit of money, he doesn't want to have to do another job other than write. Just like before with his first wife, living in the mountains. And they come back to Louisville, they buy an old barn, again in the middle of nowhere, and he basically says to her, I'm not gonna work, I've got to write. And they kind of end up living like he did with his first wife, with very little money, in a really falling down place. And she basically he writes his next novel, Child of God, and interestingly, in a weird way, because it's very difficult to know exactly how he got to write a screenplay, but he did write a screenplay. But she lives with him, but she gets sick, really sick, again, they live in this old barn, they're washing their clothes in the lake, they have no proper electricity, and she gets sick of it. She gets sick of it, but he gets sick of her complaining about it. And one day, and she said this is one of the few things we know about Cormac McCarthy in biography, is that because she wrote a little book talking about her life, she became a teacher, Annie, became a teacher, and she wrote a little memoir about him and her. And she said, one day, I woke up and he was gone. He just disappeared and moved to Texas and left her. They had no children. And she said, he walked out the door, and this is the sad thing, she said, he walked out the door, and I spent 20 years waiting for him to walk back in the door. But he never did. So she kind of loved him for the rest of her, well, she's alive, but the rest of her life. But anyway, he wrote Child of God, which again is, Child of God, interestingly, it's one of the few books that's set in a relatively modern time period. It is set in the 1960s, so it's not very far out. He published it in '73. Most of his books, pretty much all of his books, are set in the past. They're set at least 20 years. The Road is an exception because it's set in the future, but everything else is largely set in the past, at least 20 years before the time of his writing the novel. This is pretty much contemporary, and Child of God is another book where he explores this idea. This is, again, it's a guy's an outsider, lives in a shack outside normal civilization, and is a serial killer. Lester Ballard, a serial killer, a murderer, a rapist, a kind of outsider on a grand scale. And Lester Ballard becomes his first monster, his first real literary monster. And there's a succession of literary monsters in McCarthy's work, and Lester Ballard, Child of God, is the first one. Now, I mentioned that he also then does this television series. Somebody contacted him and said, we're writing there's a television series, we've got this idea for this, we want you to write an episode of this series, like a Southern Gothic thing. So he does, and he writes this thing which becomes called The Gardener's Son. It is published, the screenplay is published. You saw a little bit of it in the montage, and I think I've got a bit of it, say it was published. And this very rare photograph has him with, there he is on the far right. This is him working with a creative team on The Gardener's Son. It's very difficult to see. You can actually watch the whole thing on YouTube. It is there, not subtitled, but it is there. It's an odd, quite violent film. And it's not really clear. Maybe he just did do this for the money. It's an interesting curio. And if you're interested in McCarthy, it's worth looking out. He then went on, and what we know about him after he broke up from his wife and before he published this, is that he'd gone through a time when he moved to Texas where he clearly led a bit of a wild existence. He drank a lot, he hung out with all kinds of weird and wonderful people. And then in 1976, 77, he decided he was giving up drinking and he became teetotal. He never drank alcohol again the rest of his life. And he published this, and this is the closest that Cormac McCarthy ever got to publishing an autobiography. This really is about his life in the previous 10 years. And you can see in the way in which he talks about his relationships, about the drinking, that this really is him drawing on his own personal life. And it's the least of his books that's like it's not a crime thriller, it's not a Western, it's very much an odd, idiosyncratic book, because it's actually him putting onto the page what his own experiences had been over the last few years, rather than it actually being part of these other novels, which are very much carving this, being interested in the West, being interested in American history, being interested in outsiders, being interested in violence and the violence that underlies society. This is not like that. It's quite different. Now, just I won't show you a clip of God and Son, but he's in El Paso, and the thing I should say is that he's published these books, and none of them have earned him any money. I think the most that any one of these books sold was a few thousand copies. They got great reviews in America. I don't think they were translated into other languages at that time. They got great reviews, but nobody bought them. And he was what you might regard as a kind of cult novelist. It's a sort of, people in America said, wow, this guy's great. And he kept being given awards for his work. So this is the latest award. Two great writers, Saul Bellow, Shelby Foote. He gets the MacArthur Fellowship. And it's quite a lot of money that he's given, which gives him the freedom not to starve and to travel and research his next novel, because he still refuses to teach, to lecture. He won't do book signings. He won't do anything to publicize his work at all. He's still never given, at this point, an interview about his work. So nobody knows who he is, really, apart from a few literary critics and a few other writers who are impressed with him. So then he does this sort of odyssey, traveling around the southwest of America and doing all this research into the American West in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and the lawlessness of the American West, and the racism and violence of the American West, the slaughter of the first people of Native Americans, the vigilante bands, the scalp hunters as they were called. And he's fascinated by these real-life characters, these real-life extraordinary violent men. And he does all this research, which takes him quite a long time. If you think about it, it's like 5 years. And the McCarthy Fellowship helps him enormously. And then he publishes this. And I linger on this because this may be the greatest thing he ever wrote. Maybe. It's certainly, I mean, nobody bought it at the time. It got these incredible reviews, but nobody bought it. But what happened over time was people kept coming back and saying, you know, this is the best American novel of the year. This is the best American novel of the decade. This is the best American novel of the last 20 years. Is this the best American novel of the 20th century? And suddenly this was being compared with Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, you know, you name these great American novels, and it was being compared with them. It's an extremely, for those of you who haven't read it, it's an extremely tough book. It's tough for two reasons. One, it's tough because McCarthy was refining his style as a writer. And he had a very, very particular view of writing, which was that he was deeply influenced. His biggest influence, I mentioned it earlier, was William Faulkner. And Faulkner wrote in this way that's influenced by Joyce, stream of consciousness with complex language and a very particular attitude to punctuation. McCarthy dispenses with punctuation. He said, again in one of the rare interviews, about how he didn't believe in all these silly marks on a page. And so he writes in a very complex, oblique, declarative, as we would describe it, style. And secondly, he plunges into the violence and destructiveness and savagery of the American West in a way that very, very few writers ever explored. Again, there is no taboo in Blood Meridian. Some people said that they actually found it actually difficult to carry on reading the book because of what he describes in the book. But the book is a masterpiece. And it kind of established him critically as this really important novelist. But he was still a cult novelist. He still wasn't selling anything. It was just that people said, wow, he's fantastic. And the book, if you read it and reread it, it's an extraordinary book which straddles being a historical exploration. There are characters in it based on real characters from the American West. Incidents are real incidents, overlaid with this extraordinary, brutal, nihilistic fiction. And the thing that you realise about this and Cormac McCarthy's worldview is that it is at best nihilistic. He does not believe in happy endings. He does not believe in romantic happiness. He does not believe in the good of man. He does not believe that people have a moral compass. He believes that the worst that can happen will happen, and that the weak and the meek will not inherit the earth. And actually only the bad and the worse than bad will survive. And that comes through in Blood Meridian, and it carries on through the rest of his work. Then things changed. And it's difficult to say that Cormac McCarthy lightened up, but he changed his publisher. He has a different editor, and he starts to write what becomes a trilogy of books, the first one being All the Pretty Horses. And the publishers suddenly realise that McCarthy has written something that is softer. It's not happy, it's not positive, it's not optimistic, but something that is more romantic, that is more... And he has a leading character, Joe Grady Cole, who is a young man who believes in love, who is optimistic, who is a hero. It's arguably his first hero, maybe his only real hero, is John Grady Cole. And he writes All the Pretty Horses, and the publisher suddenly realizes, my God, this is not anywhere near as bleak. It's still violent. It's full of suspense and brutality, but it's not Blood Meridian. It's Blood Meridian light by several degrees. And the publishers realize they're onto something, and the new publisher and the new editor say, we think we can sell this book, but you have to talk about it. And after months of negotiation, bingo, his first ever interview with the press. Venomous Fiction becomes the most famous text, if you like, about Cormac McCarthy, written pretty much in his lifetime. This profile, where this New York Times journalist goes down to meet him in the South and hangs out with Cormac McCarthy for a couple of days and gets him to talk. He still doesn't want to talk about his work. He'll talk about anything else other than his work. But this is a direct quote from Richard Woodward, the guy who wrote the poem. Talk about rattlesnakes, molecular computers, country music, Wittgenstein, anything than himself or his books. So he spends 2 days trying to get McCarthy to say, well, let's talk about All the Pretty Horses. Yeah, but let's talk about this, or that, or that. And this is, again, a direct quote. of all the subjects I'm interested in, it would be extremely difficult to find one I wasn't. Writing is way, way down at the bottom of the list. But it's the best we're going to get about McCarthy talking about his work. It's the nearest we ever get. And he continues the trilogy, All the Pretty Horses. The Crossing is about a different character, Billy Parnham. And then he brings the two characters who are in All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing together and has a narrative that crosses over in Cities of the Plain. And these definitely are the most accessible books, and actually, interestingly, probably the ones that are farthest. They are dark. They definitely have elements of crime in them. The Mexican settings. By this time, he's learned Spanish, and so there's actually characters speaking Spanish, untranslated, in the books, because he's very interested in that culture, and Mexican and the border culture. But these are undoubtedly the most accessible books he ever wrote, and at the time, phenomenal bestsellers. All of a sudden, he becomes financially independent, and everybody in the world knows his name for the first time. Suddenly, we know who Cormac McCarthy is. These books are sold all over the world. Everybody's reading them, and he becomes a bestseller author. And so 68 to 92, nobody's heard of him. I mean, that makes no money at all. And then in the course of, about 5 years, he becomes wealthy and famous, but he doesn't like being famous. So mainstream success, he becomes successful, and the book and the trilogy is regarded as kind of modern classic. Interestingly, very weird little diversion he has at this point is that he goes to Washington and he writes a play called The Stonemason, which is actually about a black working class family in the 1970s, the father of whom is a stonemason, carves things out for funerals, for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was workshopped at this theatre, but was never staged. It was then published, but it's a weird thing, and I've never quite got to the bottom of it, but he wrote the play, they did a kind of workshop version of it, but it was never, ever publicly shown, and I'm not quite clear why. I don't know whether the theatre decided it wasn't going to work with the public, or he had second thoughts. He did allow it to be published, but to my knowledge, it's never been staged in front of a public audience. And then, as he's having this incredible success, he meets his third wife. There he is, as you can see, quite a bit younger than him, Jennifer Winkley, and then they have their son, John Francis. His second son is very important in McCarthy's career, and I'll explain why in a little minute. They move to Santa Fe, and Santa Fe in New Mexico becomes his sanctuary. This is where he spends pretty much the rest of his life. He moves there, and he becomes attached to this academic institution, and it's mainly a science institution. It isn't an arts institution. It isn't really about literature. It has those things, but it's really an institution about maths, physics, technology, and he hangs out with the professors, with the academics there, and they give him an office there where he can write, but he doesn't teach, he doesn't speak to the students, he's nowhere in the pub. He basically has his private sanctuary where he's protected, and he hangs out and talks about mathematics and science with the professors, and he writes on this little manual typewriter. He doesn't have a computer, he doesn't have a mobile phone, he doesn't do anything technologically at all. He writes on a manual Olivetti computer, typewriter. He owns two of them in his entire life. He writes entire work on two typewriters. And he hangs out there, and he's married to his third wife. Then, because of the success of All the Pretty Horses, he's approached by the actor-director Billy Bob Thornton at a big film company to make a version. He didn't write the screenplay, but Billy Bob Thornton's riding high because he's made this film, Sling Blade. They give him a big budget. Matt Damon is cast along, you know, I mean, a huge cast. And it is a big, expensive film. They get the acclaimed composer, musician Daniel Lanois to write this extraordinary score. And they finish the film, and it's a cut of nearly 3 hours. And Matt Damon thinks they've made a masterpiece. Penelope Cruz thinks they've made a masterpiece. And Billy Bob Thornton's very happy. And the film company hates it, absolutely hates it, and says, no, this is not going to be, we're going to cut this down to 2 hours. We hate the soundtrack. Wipe the soundtrack off. We're going to have something more commercial. And we're not going to use your cut, Billy Bob, of All the Pretty Horses. And the film costs, I think it cost about 30 million, something like this. And it was a disaster, total, utter disaster. And Matt Damon's never forgiven the film company or all the executives involved. And he talked about it for years after in interviews, saying, the cut I saw was a great movie. The cut that's on DVD, that's was available in cinemas, was a complete wreck. And the cut, apparently, of this film still exists with the original soundtrack on it. It still exists. And at one point, Miramax, who were partly behind the film, said, OK, we'll let you release the original version. This is years later. But actually, they didn't release the original version because the musician, Daniel Lanois, was so upset with what happened and then wiping him off the soundtrack, that he refused to allow his score to be used. And Billy Bob Thornton said, well, if they won't allow his music to be used, I'm not going to allow for the cut to be released. And so the cut still is locked up somewhere, waiting for a day that somebody says, yes, let's see the original All the Pretty Horses. I certainly, for one, would love to see that version of the film. And I think, let's play a little bit of the trailer. Play this video, please. Just so that we're only...
Hell, you're a regular old desperado, ain't you?
In a land far from home.
You rode here from Texas?
Yes, sir. There's Don Hector, the rear house, owns this whole shebang. 27,000 acres. Frank's been in this family 170 years.
John Cole found the adventure he'd always dreamed of. But the journey he never imagined was the one that began with a look.
She's probably used to dating guys got their own airplanes, let alone cars.
She's gonna get me in trouble.
You are in trouble. It is not trouble for you to be seen together. This is another country. A woman's reputation is all she has.
I know the old man likes you. That don't mean he's gonna stand still for you courting his daughter.
You're probably right.
I only showed that big because the fact is that it gets the whole tone of the book wrong. The trailer gets the tone of the book, and the way they re-edited gets the tone of the book wrong. And that's what made Matt Damon so angry about what had happened. There's then a gap. There's then a gap after the success of the Border trilogy and his McCarthy's annoyance about the film of All the Pretty Horses and etc. And then, interestingly, he doesn't write a novel. He writes this. And it's actually originally a screenplay. He writes it as a screenplay in acts, scenes, but whether at the time in 2005, I'm not quite sure, nobody immediately picked up on it. So his publisher said, why don't we just publish it? Why don't you rewrite it as a novel? And so he takes out the screenplay structure and he rewrites it as a novel, which is published in 2005. And this is probably the most, in inverted commas, straightforward Cormac McCarthy novel. This is the nearest to a conventional thriller that McCarthy would ever write. And as a result, one of the most successful, but also one of the most obvious to make into a movie. It started life as a screenplay. It's written as a thriller. It has all his classic concerns, but language-wise, it's the most straightforward of his works. And it's about a drug deal that goes bad. It has one of his most most appealingly monstrous monsters as the lead hitman in this, and people loved it. And actually, as soon as it had been published and the reviews came out, everyone in Hollywood was like, well, this we can make a movie into, this we need to look at. Whilst that's sort of going on, he then decides to write a play. Again, I don't know why, there's no explanation. He never explained why he wrote it, but he wrote a play, but he didn't, unlike with the Stonemason, he didn't even attempt to get this produced in a theatre. It was never staged. He wrote it, it was published, and at the time, because of everything else either side of it, No Country for Old Men and what came after it, it sort of disappeared. It was published and people said, oh, he's written a play, but nobody's staged the play, so forget it. So that went on, as we would say, on the back burner. It went into the shadows and it was kind of ignored. And whilst people were ignoring that, he was writing this, which of course became, after The Pretty Horses, became the most successful thing that Cormac McCarthy wrote in his lifetime. It came out of a road trip he did with his son, his then young son, and they were kind of traveling, just the two of them. They were traveling. He was in the process of getting divorced from his wife, and he made a road trip with his son, staying in motels and then looking at different parts of the West, and he was thinking a lot about his son's future and what would happen in the future, and the fact that he'd broken up from his wife, and he was feeling melancholy about his divorce, he was feeling melancholy about the future, and this kind of inspired him to write this book, which he took to a whole new level of bleakness, and also wrote the only thing that I could describe as a sci-fi noir road movie, as it became, sci-fi noir novel, which becomes a sci-fi noir film. And all of a sudden, he goes straight back into the headlines after a bit of a hiatus where he's not really been seen around, nobody's been taking any notes of him, and he wins the Pulitzer Prize, one of the most prestigious prizes in the world, and most prestigious prize in America for fiction. Of course, he doesn't go to the ceremony. His publisher picks the award up for him at the ceremony because he won't go. And that's a picture of his publisher receiving the award for him. But he publishes the book. And whilst that's going on, these guys appear. Unknown filmmakers. The Coen brothers, and they are really, really interested in his work. Now, they've adapted, inverted commas, they've adapted other crime novels before, but never acknowledged them. Miller's Crossing is based on the work of amongst others, Dashiell Hammett. They've taken from other crime novelists, but they've never done an adaptation of a novel and never acknowledged they were doing an adaptation of a novel. This is the first time they actually buy, with a film company, a novel, No Country for Old Men, and say, we want to turn this into a faithful adaptation of the novel. McCarthy doesn't agree to write the screenplay. He has very little, if anything, to do with the making of the film, but he does like them. And he does go on set and he does see an early cut of the film. And he becomes friends with them. And it's the best film adapted from a Cormac McCarthy novel ever. It's arguably one or two, if not the best. Some people, might argue about Fargo or Miller's Crossing, or I think it's possibly the best film the Coen brothers have made as a writing, directing double act. And it's a kind of noir, Western noir masterpiece. Again, not set in the modern day, it's set in the 1980s. He again moves back, and for those of you who haven't seen it, again, this is about as bleak and as bone-dry black as it possibly can be. There's no hero that escapes intact in this. This guy, multiple serial killer, is the hero or anti-hero. And that's the book, and that's what the Coen brothers made. Let's see a tiny bit. Play the video, please, of this trailer.
Let me ask you something. What's the most you ever lost in a coin toss?
Look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything. Just call it friendo.
What's in the satchel?
More money?
He's just a guy who happened to find that money.
I got a bad feeling, Will.
It's a mess, ain't it, Sheriff?
It ain't. It'll do till the mess gets here.
We're looking for Llewellyn Moss.
You go up to his trailer.
Yeah.
Do you want to leave a message?
Yeah.
I don't come back to tell Mother I love her.
Your mother's dead.
Well, I'll tell her myself.
Got a little loose skin in here.
You think this boy Moss has got any notion of the sorts that are hunting him?
I don't know, he ought to. He's seen the same things I've seen, and it certainly made an impression on me.
Just how dangerous is it?
Compared to what? The bubonic plague?
The crime you see now, it's hard to even take its measure. It's just all out war.
Can't stop what's coming.
This guy's supposed to be the ultimate badass.
You don't understand.
Call it.
And that's actually a really good trailer for an incredibly good movie. And it kind of wins everything. Best picture, best director, best adapted screenplay, best supporting actor for Javier Bardem as Chikura, the monstrous gangster. And actually, very rarely, McCarthy actually came out of reclusiveness and went to the Academy Awards with them, sat at the table when they got all the awards. Funnily enough, that's not playing, that's actually a gift, but at this, there is a picture of him, but there's a picture of him sitting at the table, and apparently when the brothers went up to actually collect the best adapted screenplay Oscar, they brought it back to the table and sat down, and Ethan said, "It was all your words, we didn't do anything, but I'm still keeping the Oscar." And at the same time he did, all this is going on, he did this, very bizarrely. His publisher, because The Road was coming out, because it was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, because it was the first really major book he'd written for a number of years, because this had been a screenplay, is that he agrees to do this interview with Oprah, which you saw a few seconds of at the beginning. And this interview is very, very weird. If you get a chance to watch the whole thing, it's worth watching, because he does say a few interesting things in it, but it's TV car crash. Oprah does not know what she's dealing with. She has no idea kind of who she's dealing with, and she looks permanently confused as she interviews him, and he refuses to answer her questions. And it's just like, it's wonderful TV car crash. It's like Oprah Winfrey being given a writer she should never have been given, and Cormac McCarthy agreeing to do an interview he never wanted to do. But for those of us that are interested in McCarthy, it's the only one we got, so it's worth actually watching it if you get a chance. There's some of it on YouTube. And he does say a couple of interesting things about his work, a couple. Then they make the film of The Road. Interestingly, John Hillcott, who'd done some terrific films like Lawless, The Proposition, Australian action thriller director, was contacted, was asked whether he was interested. He was very interested. A British playwright and screenwriter, Penhall, does the screenplay and does a very good job adapting The Road. It's shot all over America, actually. It's shot in Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, in New Orleans. And it absolutely recreates the bleakness, the desperate dystopian bleakness and nihilism of the novel very, very accurately. And Viggo Mortensen coming off Lord of the Rings and loads of other stuff is amazing in the film, as is the young boy. And it's premiered in Venice and has a huge success. And McCarthy, again, did not do the screenplay, but he did get to know Hillcott, and they become friends. And there's a picture of the two of them together, and they become really close friends. McCarthy clearly really he liked the Coens. I mean, he gave an interview with the Coens to Rolling Stone, and he hung out with Hillcott, and Hillcott would visit him, he would visit Hillcott, and it became one of the most important, I think, late creative relationships of his life, was forming this friendship with Hillcott. And at this point, and he did his third interview, print interview, Rolling Stone, this was probably the critical high point of Cormac McCarthy's life. He's got No Country for Old Men, 4 Oscars, and the book. He's got The Road. He wins the Pulitzer Prize. The Road comes out as a movie. It's extraordinarily successful. And this is, and he gives more interviews, say, talking to Opera, talking to Rolling Stone, than he's ever given in his life before or since. Then there is, sorry, that was, and I'm going to miss it because we haven't got time. The play I mentioned earlier, Tommy Lee Jones, who'd been in No Country for Old Men, was really obsessed by McCarthy, and I think he got to know McCarthy a bit as well. And he decided he wanted to do a version of the play. And he got a bit of money from television, and the play, Sunset Limited, is all set pretty much in one room. The film is pretty much all set in one room. I wouldn't describe it as noir. It's very dark. It's about the battle between good and evil. You could say that these two characters are Satan and, I don't know whether it's Christ, but it's a battle between life and death enacted in a hotel room. Tommy Lee Jones wanting to kill himself, and Samuel L. Jackson trying to stop him killing himself and going to hell, of course, in Catholic theology, which, of course, McCarthy's a Catholic. The film was a very modest success. And actually, Tommy Lee Jones wanted to carry on and adapt other McCarthy work, including Blood Meridian. He was very interested in making a film version of Blood Meridian. but it never happened. And this film wasn't really a big success. It sort of vaguely fits into this kind of noir, but because of the nature of the subject matter. But there's no action, there's no drugs, there's no murders, there's no crime, except the crime of suicide in kind of Catholic theology. Then, and this is the odd one, this is the last published film, the last released film of Cormac McCarthy's career. For whatever reason, McCarthy decided he was going to write not another novel, he was going to write a screenplay. And he wrote a screenplay on spec, as they say, basically in order to get a film made. And of course, when it was announced that Cormac McCarthy was going to write a screenplay, everybody was interested in it. And actually, The Counselor is almost like, it's like a weird sequel to No Country for Old Men. It has some of the same things. It's about a drug deal that goes bad. It has a relationship where the leading character, the counselor, played by Michael Fassbender, his partner is kidnapped, just like in the wife of one of the main characters in No Country for Old Men. It brings back Javier Bardem as a sort of benign version of his earlier character. And no less a director than Ridley Scott decides to make this huge, big budget version based on McCarthy's script. The interesting thing is that's moved on is that there's a lot of dialogue in this. There's an awful lot of philosophical dialogue, which kind of reflects where McCarthy was in his life. He'd been hanging out at the Santa Fe Institute, I mentioned that, and he's talking to all these scientists, and he gets much, 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 much more interested in philosophy. And some of that philosophy creeps into this, which means that it's not as straightforward a thriller as No Country for Old Men. It is interesting. It's a huge budget and very glossy. There's a partnership, I think, with Armani on all the clothes. There's all this stuff, Brad Pitt's in it. You know, it's kind of... but it's a commercial success. It takes quite a lot of money, but critically, it gets slammed. In 2013.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In Italy. Well,
yeah. And this, but it wasn't. I mean, worldwide, I think it cost about 30 million, and it took 71. So it sort of worked commercially, but critically, it got pretty much slammed. And it was the last thing we see him writing. Let's just. We'll play a little bit. Play this video, please. Just a few seconds of it, because I'm aware of time.
Life is being in bed with you. Everything else is just waiting. Will you?
Yes, I will.
I intend to love you until I die.
Me first.
Counselor!
My back's against the wall, man.
Money problems are serious problems.
I need to split it up.
625 kilos, we're probably looking at 20 million.
I know why I'm in it. Do you?
The nice ring. Wanna know how much it's worth?
I always thought the law degree was a license to steal. You had it really capitalized on it.
I'm really worried, baby.
It's gonna be all right. If you pursue this road that you've embarked upon, you will eventually come to moral decisions that will take you completely by surprise.
You should be careful what you wish for.
You might not get it.
Counselor, we've got a problem.
The shipment, it's gone.
I had a call from our business partners. These people are out 20 million.
They think we're all involved, don't they?
No. Just you, Counselor. You. They don't believe in coincidences. They've heard of them. They've just never seen one.
You're in trouble. When the axe comes through the door, I'll already be gone.
What do you think I should do?
How bad is it?
We're all done here.
It's too late. I can vanish in a heartbeat. Can you?
Was Miss Slaughter to come? It's probably beyond our imagining.
You are the world you have created. And when you cease to exist, this world that you have created will also cease to exist.
So that was The Counselor, which is the last thing he wrote that was fiction for quite a long, long time. We're talking 10 years. There's this, which I haven't got time to show you a clip of, which actually I think in some ways is much, much better than The Counselor, which is James Franco, writer, actor, director, who'd made a couple of adaptations of Faulkner novels, As I Learned Down in the Sound of the Fury, directed this. It was in Venice. I actually have quite a lot of time for it. I think it's a pretty accurate version of Child of God, and this really is deep, deep noir. This is absolutely, it absolutely is that fusion of kind of in the West, isolated, it was all shot in West Virginia, about a character who knows no boundaries, who is a kind of devil living in a shack by himself, killing and raping people. And this is prime cut, I would say, McCarthy. This absolutely channels Cormac McCarthy in a way that, you know, The Counselor, although he actually wrote it, doesn't in the same way. Then there's a long hiatus. I mean, this is published. McCarthy is living on his own in the South. He writes a little scientific essay, which nobody kind of really understands. He writes a little scientific essay, and there's silence. And silence for 10 years, until in the end of October, autumn 22, all of a sudden it's announced that there's going to be not one, but 2 new Cormac McCarthy novels. And it shocks everybody, because no one had been expecting it at all. And these 2, which are inextricably linked, are published right at the end of 22. The Passenger to extraordinary reviews, Stella Maris less so, and apparently McCarthy's been working on these books for at least 20 years. They have been bubbling under. As I mentioned at the beginning, they are actually, the first one, certainly The Passenger, contains quite a lot of McCarthy's life. If you're looking for clues for McCarthy's personality, Suttree and The Passenger are the closest you're going to get to his own version of his biography. This also has underneath it a kind of thriller novel. It's a conspiracy theory. He talks about JFK and the murder of JFK, the FBI doing all kinds of weird things. There's a whole atmosphere of paranoia and schizophrenia around The Passenger. It's really interesting the way in which it takes lots of his other themes from his work, the West, isolation, people living on their own, strange things happening, inexplicable things, the failure of relationships, incest. This is about a brother and a sister that love each other and more than love each other, but don't actually commit incest, but think about committing incest. About schizophrenia and about science and maths. And what he does with these 2 books is that he spent 10 years, more than 10 years, talking to these scientists about everything, string theory, every form of mathematical theory. He pours it all into this book, that book and that book. And so what you have here is almost like an explosion, a deconstruction of the genre novel, a deconstruction of the crime novel, a deconstruction of his own work. And he throws in every philosophical, mathematical, scientific theory, and basically he says, what do we think reality is about? Because actually we don't know. We can't prove anything. We don't understand anything. And what maths teaches us is that the more we study, the less we know. And it's an extraordinary pair of novels that are baffling, intriguing, annoying, all at the same time. And they're a really interesting way of him ending his career, because they end his career by saying, well, look, this is where we've got to. He's followed this journey of basically saying he doesn't really believe in society. He doesn't believe in happiness. He doesn't believe in civilization in a way, and he believes underlying all civilization is violence, death, and destruction. It's a very Thomas Hobbesian view of the world, that everything ultimately is black. And then he kind of doesn't turn it round, but he pulls it back and goes, but we don't really know, because once we start to investigate science, science blows everything apart, all our certainties anyway. And so that's what he leaves us with. He leaves us with a puzzle. He leaves us with a series of conundrums. It's one of the craziest and bravest ways to have an end to a writing career that you could possibly imagine. It further fuels the mythology of McCarthy as this extraordinary and completely and utterly unique writer. There is no one else like him. I mean, absolutely no one else. No one else would have written a book like this. And coming as it did in the wake of all that success, you know, with what he did. And in a way, it makes sense if you look at The Road, and The Road is a book about humanity not really having a future. And then he kind of goes, well, let's look at that a bit more, but look at it through the prism of science and technology, and put a bit of a thriller underlying it. And that's what he leaves us with these novels. Interestingly enough, after this was finished, in April this year, it was announced that he was working on a new screenplay, of the infamous Moby Dick novel, Blood Meridian, to be made by John Hillcott, the guy who made The Road. And we don't know whether he finished the screenplay. It was announced in April. He then, dies in June. And we don't know whether he finished the screenplay, and we don't know whether Hillcott's going to make the film. Because apparently he'd been ill for some period over the course of the last year, and that's why I think he decided to finish the two novels while he could. And then he started working on the screenplay and was more and more poorly, and kept having to stop on the screenplay, and then died. And we don't actually know, so it's tantalizing. Are we finally going to get the film of Blood Meridian? After all these years, there have been so many people trying to make it. Tommy Lee Jones was going to make it, as I said. James Franco, who made Child of God, was going to make it. But Hillcott announced it, and a film company is backing it, so we'll see. It'll be interesting. But just going back, and this is finally me wrapping, is that it's an extraordinary career. As I say, 12 novels, a few screenplays, a couple of plays, a career which largely was lived out of the limelight, a career where apparently McCarthy was a very funny, friendly guy when you were talking about architecture, maths, science, technology, until you opened literature. He did watch movies. He liked Terrence Malick movies a lot. He liked Bob Rafelson, 5 Easy Pieces he cites. He didn't like foreign language movies. He hated European intellectual literature. He hated Henry James and Proust. He hated magical realism and hated Latin American literature, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because he didn't believe in the realism of those novels. He believed in something more primitive, and that's reflected in his work. So in some ways, he was extremely conservative aesthetically in terms of what he was interested in, what he believed. But that's probably what made him such a great novelist, is because he had a very, very original train of thought, and he didn't mix with writers, he didn't hang out with writers, he had no other writers that were friends of his. And because he didn't mix with literary academics, he didn't mix with poets, he didn't mix with other novelists, he hung out with a couple of filmmakers, that was it, is that he had a purity of vision that he explored. He explored over the course of those 12 novels and those screenplays, a purity of vision about his view of America, his view of the past, his view of human nature, his view of civilization, his view of there being no moral compass, his nihilistic and despairing and poetic and beautiful and horrific view. And that's why I think that he was a Western novelist. That's why I think he was a Southern Gothic novelist, but that's why I really believe he was a noir novelist, because for him, he always believed in the darkness first. And at that point, I'll shut up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. It was amazing, even if very dark journey into Cormac McCarthy life. And so, now, ora tocca a voi con le domande, se ne avete naturalmente. Any questions?
I've stunned everybody into silence.
It means everything was clear. they got to understand everything. You want to?
Yeah.
Take a rest.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's nice to have you here, and it was incredible, the story. I haven't heard about before, so it's quite interesting. And my question is, if there will be some films and some secrets about his life that he wanted to make, like a story that he threw away or something like that.
It's a good question, because we, as I said, I mean, what I've told you about his life is pretty much what exists. You know, there isn't, and you know, we know a little bit about his second marriage through his second wife. What we really don't know, though, very much about what he did during, certainly the first 25 years of his life is pretty obscure, you know, and whether, you know, how he, certainly in the novel Sutri, he talks about drinking, hanging out with all kinds of bad people, and in The Passenger, he talks about hanging out with criminals. And what we really don't know is whether, you know, how much of his life is going to be revealed. I mean, for example, John le Carré, in the last 3-4 years since John le Carré died, there's been a whole ton of stuff exposing his relationships, his real work as a spy, or, you know, things that John le Carré, who came here to Noir and Fest, hid. And we've suddenly found out a ton of stuff about le Carré that we never knew. I have a feeling we're going to find out more about Cormac McCarthy. We're going to find out more than we ever knew. And the question is whether, did he finish this screenplay? Don't know. We're going to find that out, I'm sure. Did he leave any other work? Because the other thing I didn't say is that he seemed to be writing 3 or 4 things at the same time. He would write a bit of one thing and leave it and write something else. So there may be some unpublished stories or manuscripts that we just don't know about, because because these books, Passenger and St. Mary's, he started writing them apparently in the 1980s. So they were sitting there for 40 years before he decided to publish them. So whether there's some unpublished work, whether there's, I suspect there may be some unpublished work, and I suspect there's going to be quite a lot that comes out about McCarthy's life that we just don't know, because he hid it for so many years. It's going to be fascinating now, because he's only just died, so it always takes a little bit of time. But I think about John le Carré, and I think, wow, in the last 2-3 years, we've learned more in the last 2 years about le Carré than we knew in the previous 25 years. So we may find out that there's more, and there may be another novel. There may be another novel. There may be some stories. We're going to have to wait and see. I guess it will depend on his children, you know, his son, yeah, and what they want to do, you know.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Potete anche farla in italiano la domanda, se non ve la sentite la traduciamo, non è un problema.
Yeah, please go far away if there's anybody who wants to ask anything else. I've stunned everybody into silence. Well, I hope if you haven't seen all these movies, or you haven't read all the books, that it encourages you to do, to have a look at them, because they are fantastic. They are genuinely fantastic.
Thank you for the great presentation, first of all. Can I ask personally, what is your favorite movie or your favorite work?
Of his?
Yeah, of his.
My favorite movie is definitely No Country for Old Men, because I think it's a terrific. It sort of encapsulates. It contains all the hallmarks of McCarthy in a fairly simple way, but in a brilliant way. So it's my favourite movie of his work. Definitely is my favourite movie of his work. In terms of the books, the first book of his I really loved was All the Pretty Horses, and I loved it because it's such a romantic odyssey of the American West and the 1940s and all these things. But intellectually, I have to admit that his greatest achievement, it may be Blood Meridian, because it's an epic, and it's so dark, it's so disturbing, and I just don't think anyone else could have written that book. I think it's so powerful, and it's absolutely the DNA of Cormac McCarthy as his darkest. It's an incredible book. I hope it does get made into a film, although, how they're going to make it into a film, because several people have said that, Blood Meridian's almost impossible, so it'll be interesting to see whether they succeed.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Speaking in terms of not comparison, but relations or references to other writers, there are two writers I have in mind when talking about. Of course, he's unique. It's no comparison. But from one side, the American one side, it's Elmore Leonard. I'm thinking about the Western tales. From the other side, the British side, I would think about Ian McEwan. In some terms related to common themes or issue touching the dark side of human relationships, familiar relationship, thinking about incest, thinking about children's trauma, and so on and so on. What do you have to say about this?
I think the Ian McEwan analogy is a really interesting one, because you're absolutely right that when McEwan started writing in England in the 1970s, his books, things like The Comfort of Strangers, etc., were regarded as kind of almost horror in a way. They weren't, but they were regarded as, and definitely McEwan, certainly in that early work, was breaking taboos, that people weren't writing serious fiction that wasn't just John, but wasn't writing serious fiction that had those taboo subjects in them in the way that McEwan was. So I think that's an interesting analogy. I think you're absolutely right about Elmore Leonard. I think in terms of, there are two people who you could describe as contemporaries of McCarthy, but they worked completely differently, and as far as I know, they didn't know each other. Elmore Leonard, yes, because he wrote westerns and then he wrote noir novels. His novels are very much, as you know, Marina, only too well, based on dialogue, and whereas he didn't,
you know, when he writes crime fiction, they were Florida and Detroit, you know, and sometimes Los Angeles. Yeah, but they are American epics. The other interesting comparison I would make, apart from Elmer Leonard, and I think Elmer Leonard is spot on, absolutely, is the other writer I would compare him to, again, a relatively obscure writer, but the Coens went on and adapted one of his novels, is the American novelist Charles Portis, who wrote True Grit. And Portis is a very obscure character who only wrote 3-4 novels. It's not very known. No, and he's not very known kind of anywhere. Do you know what I mean? Apart from that film, True Grit, he's not known at all. But if you read Portis, there's a little, you know, you could imagine them being somehow, you know, in the same, somehow partly the same worldview. And he's the other example I would give. But Elmore Leonard, no, absolutely. Because because he talked so little, McCarthy, he talked so little about other writers. Occasionally he talks about, he mentions Henry Miller, throws out Henry Miller and talks about Henry Miller, or loving Herman Melville. But he talks so little about other writers. Hemingway he liked. He was a fan of Hemingway. And obviously adored Faulkner, absolutely loved Faulkner. But no contemporary writers, I can't think of anything he ever said where he acknowledged another writer at all. not one.
Qualcun altro? Ho visto alzare una mano, ma era per caso. There's a lot of things to say, but from my point of view, it's obvious also try to look into the female word, not existing female word in Cormac McCarthy writings that they are completely excluded. So maybe we can guess from, apart from Stella Maris, but no, the last one, yes, just the last one, yes.
What's interesting about that is you're absolutely right.
Maybe it's coming also from his private life, some kind of experience.
Yeah, he only
and the end, that was a good suggestion from Mazzino. Why at the very end, there is the famous word?
It's interesting because
kind of repenting.
You're right. There is. I mean, in the novels, the Outer Dark has a main female character who is the sister of a brother who has a child with her brother, and it's an incest story. That's the second novel, and she's a major character. She's the last major character basically you have Alexandra in All the Pretty Horses, the woman that Joe Grady Cole loves and doesn't end up with, and then years later in Cities of the Plain you have the Mexican prostitute Magdalena. You know, I'm literally naming the female characters in Cormac McCarthy. So you have they're all impossible. There's a woman who is bereft because her brother commits incest with her. They have a child. He then takes the child away, and she spends the whole book trying to find the child and is completely distraught and bereft. You have a woman who the main character can't have, and another woman, a Mexican prostitute, who's then murdered. And so women are completely and utterly marginalised in the overwhelming majority of his fiction, and then they're always victims. I mean, in No Country for Old Men, Moss, the character, she's kidnapped and murdered. In The Counsellor, the counsellor's girlfriend is kidnapped and murdered. You know, so pretty much all the women in McCarthy end up dead. You know, dead until the end. And then we have a suicidal maths genius. That's Stella Maris, you know. And that's intriguing because, again, she is involved. it comes back to his very early work. It's an incestuous relationship with her brother. She loves her brother more than anyone else on planet Earth. And she's a maths genius, and the whole of the second book is all about her talking about her life and maths in a mental asylum. And it's a very, very, you've read it, it's a very difficult book. It's a very, very odd final book for him to write with her as this character. And I don't know, I can't pretend that I think he suddenly thought, I feel guilty, I better write about a woman. I don't think that at all. I think that it's just the way he wanted this person to be. He didn't want, I think as the last character, he didn't want, the passenger is a projection of him. It's definitely a projection of, a version of him, that character. This character, he didn't want to be a projection of him, and so he had to find a character that was so unlike him that he could be a vehicle, she could be a vehicle for all these ideas he's absorbed. That's why I think it's a woman. I don't think it's anything, I think that's why it's a woman.
Last question, and then we all go away. Don't you think there is something, or I'm asking you, you know absolutely better than me, critics, what the critics, literary critics wrote about him, because from himself it's very difficult to know what he thought about his writing. But is there any connection, because I see a lot of connection with the biblical culture, with the Bible? I mean, the religious part of his philosophy, writing about, because he was somebody who went to the roots, of course, of human existence very clearly. So when he's speaking about darkness, it's clearly speaking about God and the human fate. No hope for the human fate because everyone is mortal, and so on and so on.
There's no two ways about it. There's a framework within the books, because there's a framework where constantly good and evil is talked about, and because he was brought up as an Irish Catholic, I absolutely believe there's an underlying Catholic theological framework that informs his work. There's no two ways about it. It's most apparent in things like Sunset Limited, but it's there all the way through. But whereas he has some of his characters believing in God, he absolutely does not believe in God. He absolutely does. And I think that he does not believe in redemption. He does not believe in hope.
That's why I was talking about Bible, not New Testament, the Old Testament.
But even the Old Testament has, God is there somewhere,
But God is also evil.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, maybe that's true. But what I'm saying, though, I think that Cormac McCarthy believed in using the apparatus, if you like, the philosophical apparatus of religion, but he absolutely did not believe in religion at all.
No, I can imagine, but the stories he made up and the writings, it's full of this kind of philosophy.
No, it is full of it. You're absolutely right. I mean, but
in the New Testament, God is a savior, but in the Old Testament, he's the punishment. Send the punishment to humanity. So I think this kind of God, which is it identified with nature, the wild nature he was living in, he was trusting, and so on and so on. This is something which belongs to the Old Testament idea of God.
It is. I absolutely agree. I guess the difference is that I think when you look at the characters who are agents, the monstrous agents, with Chikuro in No Country for Old Men, whether it's the judge in Blood Meridian, whether it's Lee in Child of God, they are they're devils. They're not God. They are Satan, if you like. That's what I mean. Is that he goes beyond the idea of God punishing the Old Testament. And he spends a lot of time in his novels trying to define pure evil. Pure evil. And I think that's why I used the Hobbesian. He was not a liberal humanist, Cormac McCarthy. He did not believe in nurture. He believed in nature. He's a deeply conservative writer in that sense. He believed that evil was inherent in man.
That's why I was mentioning
but,
Bible.
Yeah.
Because also it's dealing with the American culture of the pioneer and coming from Europe,
No, absolutely.
Okay. I think for now it's enough. So thank you, Adrian, for this wonderful masterclass on this wonderful writer. Grazie a voi per essere stati con noi.
Thanks for coming.
I have something to remember for this afternoon. Volevo invitarvi a tornare oggi alle 16. Qui avremo un incontro su un libro molto interessante credo per i ragazzi, perché è un giallo, si intitola Morte di un trapper, scritto da Giovanni Robertini, che insomma è un giallista diciamo solo di recente, infatti è il suo primo libro, ma insomma ha una grande carriera nel mondo della musica, è stato il direttore prima di Linus, adesso di Rolling Stones, e racconta il mondo musicale dei trapper e dei rapper, però insomma facendone morire un po', quindi insomma sarà una discussione molto interessante su questo mondo, e il libro è ambientato a Milano. Ne parliamo qui alle ore 16 con l'autore, quindi vi invito a tornare. Grazie.
Tweet out.